You can't stay silent forever, Ethan!
I just stopped pretending there's anything left to save.
I don't think I did anything wrong. I just made a small joke at a party. Everyone laughed. I didn't expect my husband to walk out that night, or that the next time I'd see him, it'd be for something official. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Liora Vale, and I swear I didn't mean to humiliate anyone. It was just one joke, one tiny, stupid joke at a party, and somehow it ended my marriage. Everyone laughed when I said it. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and I wanted to be funny, to seem effortless, the kind of woman who could make people laugh without trying. I didn't even look at Ethan when I said it. I just smiled, waiting for him to laugh along like he always did. But he didn't. He just stood there, quiet, face unreadable, and then he walked out. No shouting, no scene, just gone. At first, I told everyone he was being dramatic, that he'd cool off by morning. I even laughed about it later that night. But when I came home, his side of the bed was cold, his mug rinsed clean, and something in the house felt finished. I still don't think I did anything wrong. It was only a joke. People joke about their partners all the time. But maybe the worst kind of damage isn't loud. It's the kind that begins in silence, when someone decides they're done explaining why they deserve respect. The night of the party started like any other weekend. Music, lights, a crowd of familiar faces, and me trying too hard to look effortless. We were at Jordan's house, one of Ethan's co-workers, celebrating his promotion. The place was buzzing, people holding glasses of champagne and laughing at everything that wasn't really funny. I remember thinking how good it felt to be around people who noticed me. At home, Ethan barely looked up from his laptop anymore, but here, every time I said something, people listened. Ethan was there too, of course, standing near the kitchen island, talking quietly to a few of the guys from work. He always looked out of place at these things, buttoned up, polite, too serious for the kind of teasing that made everyone else feel alive. I loved him, I think, but I also loved the attention that came when I played the role of the charming, confident wife. That night, I wore the new dress I'd told him not to worry about buying. He said it was too much money for something I'd wear once. I told him it was an investment. Maybe I wanted him to notice me the way strangers did. It was Amira who started it, really. She asked jokingly if Ethan ever got jealous seeing me around so many people. I laughed and said no, that he wasn't really the jealous type. She said I was lucky because her boyfriend would have been glaring at anyone who looked at her too long. Everyone laughed, and someone handed me another drink. The glass felt cool and sharp in my hand. I said something like, "Please, Ethan's too calm to be jealous. He's calm about everything, even in bed." I thought I said it quietly. Maybe I did, but the music dropped right at that moment, and suddenly, everyone heard it. The laughter hit before I could stop it. It was the kind of laughter that feeds itself. One person giggles, another joins in, and suddenly you're surrounded by noise. Amira slapped my arm and said, "Girl, stop, you're terrible." But she was laughing too. Someone at the edge of the group asked, "Wait, what did she say?" And another voice repeated it, louder. I remember that moment stretching out like it lasted forever, my words turning into something heavier, uglier, as they moved from mouth to mouth. I turned to look at Ethan. He was standing just a few feet away, holding his drink. His expression didn't change much. No anger, no raised voice. Just that calm, unreadable look he always had when he didn't want to give me what I wanted. The silence between us felt louder than the laughter around us. Then he set his glass down on the counter, said something softly to Jordan, something like thanks for having us, and walked out the door. At first, I laughed it off. Told everyone he was just tired, that he'd been working long hours. Someone joked that he probably needed a minute to cool down, and I agreed, pretending to be amused. But inside, my stomach dropped. I finished my drink too quickly and smiled until my cheeks hurt. Everyone tried to move on, talking about something else, but I couldn't stop glancing at the door, waiting for him to come back. He didn't. When the party wound down, Amira offered to drive me home. I said no, that I'd call a car. I wanted to control the story before it spread. I told her Ethan was just sensitive sometimes, that he'd get over it by morning. She nodded, saying men could be dramatic, and that made me feel a little better. I wanted to believe it. On the ride home, I scrolled through my phone, looking for any message from him. Nothing. When I got home, the lights were off. His car was in the driveway, but the living room felt cold. I walked upstairs and saw his clothes neatly folded on the chair by the window, like he'd been there and decided not to stay. His side of the bed was untouched. I lay down on mine, staring at the ceiling, telling myself he'd sleep it off. That's what people do after fights. They cool down and talk later. But he didn't talk the next morning. He was already up, dressed, sitting at the table, reading something on his phone. I tried to sound casual, said, "You disappeared fast last night." He looked up briefly and said, "You were having fun." I said, "Oh, come on, it was just a joke. Everyone was laughing." He nodded once, slowly, then said, "Everyone but me." I rolled my eyes, trying to lighten it. "You're taking it too seriously. You know I didn't mean anything by it." He didn't argue. He just sipped his coffee and went back to scrolling on his phone. That annoyed me more than anger would have. I told him I couldn't stand when he shut down like that he was being childish. He said, "I just don't find it funny when someone I love turns me into a punchline." I told him he was overreacting. He said, "Maybe." And then he stood, rinsed his cup, and set it carefully on the opposite side of the counter from mine. That small act, that quiet separation of space, felt heavier than any shouting. Later that day, Amira sent me a message with a clip someone had posted online, a short video from the party. You could hear the laughter, see me smiling, holding my glass, the look on Ethan's face as he turned to leave. The caption read, "When the wife's too honest." I laughed when I saw it, even shared it with a winking emoji, pretending it didn't bother me, but my hands were shaking. By afternoon, I noticed little things around the house that felt different. A drawer in his desk was locked. His laptop had a new password. A folder labeled Utilities sat neatly stacked with another one that said Household. He'd never been that organized before. When I asked about it, he said he was just catching up on paperwork. I said he was acting like an accountant. He said, "Someone has to." That night, we barely spoke. I made pasta, but he didn't eat much. I tried to make another joke to ease the tension, told him he could finally be famous since people were quoting our little moment online. He said, "Fame isn't always admiration." I told him he was reading too much into things. He said quietly, "You always think it's about how things look, not what they mean." I didn't answer. I didn't know how. I went upstairs and lay in bed, scrolling through the comments on that post. Some people said I was brave for being so open. Others said I was cruel. I only paid attention to the ones that said brave. I told myself people who called it cruel just didn't get my sense of humor. Around midnight, I heard a faint humming sound from downstairs. I thought it was the fridge at first, but it was the printer. When I went down, a blank page was sitting in the tray. The air smelled faintly like toner. I asked him what he was printing, and he said, "Nothing, just testing." Then he turned off the light and went back to the guest room. The next morning, he left early again. His mug was clean and dry, sitting alone on the counter beside mine, which still had coffee in it from the night before. I stared at them both, side by side but separate. That tiny gap between them looked like a wall I didn't know how to climb. At work, people were talking. Someone had seen the video. They laughed when they mentioned it, asking if Ethan was really mad or if it was just your couple's humor. I smiled and said we were fine. that he was just dramatic. But by lunchtime, I'd checked my phone a dozen times. Still no message from him. When I got home that evening, the house smelled faintly of paper and cleaning solution. The trash had been taken out, and a pile of mail sat neatly sorted on the table. I called his name. No answer. I noticed the guest room door was closed. I wanted to knock but didn't. Instead, I stood in the hallway, staring at the door, hearing nothing. I told myself again that he just needed space, that once he realized how small this really was, things would go back to normal. People say marriages survive worse. I believed that. I needed to. Because if I let myself think he might not come back from this, that he might be quietly rearranging his life without me, I'd have to admit something I wasn't ready to face. That maybe it wasn't the joke that ruined everything. Maybe it was that he finally stopped laughing along with me. The next week, I convinced myself things were fine. That's how I always dealt with tension. Pretend long enough and it disappears. Ethan went to work at the same time every morning, came home around 6, and said little. I told myself that meant he was moving on. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. At the office, people were still talking about the video. Someone had reposted it with a caption calling it marriage goals. That made me laugh out loud. I showed it to Amira and said, "See, people get it." She smiled awkwardly and said, "Yeah, sure, but Ethan probably didn't think it was that funny." I shrugged. He'll come around. By midweek, the story had shifted online. A small blog that wrote about real relationships shared the clip under an article about communication boundaries. I didn't even realize until someone tagged me in it. The comments were mixed, half calling me confident, half calling me cruel. I decided to only read the ones that supported me. That's what everyone does. That night, when Ethan got home, I told him about the article. I said people were discussing it as a conversation starter. He said, "They're not the ones married to you." I laughed, trying to make it lighter, and said, "You're acting like I committed a crime." He didn't answer. He went to the sink, rinsed his hands, and dried them carefully with a paper towel, before folding it in half and throwing it away. His movements were slow, precise, like someone performing a task for a reason I didn't understand. Later, while he was in the shower, I saw a note on the fridge, a short list written in his neat handwriting: groceries, rice, detergent, printer ink. I frowned. We didn't even have a printer problem. When I asked about it, he said he liked to keep extra supplies on hand. I said he was turning into a prepper. He said calmly, "Preparation keeps things smooth." I went to bed early, expecting him to join me, but he stayed downstairs. I could hear faint tapping from his keyboard and the soft beep of what sounded like a recording app. When I asked what he was working on, he said, "Just organizing." The next morning, Amira called me on my way to work. She said someone at her gym had mentioned the party clip, that people were gossiping about how cold Ethan looked in it. I said, "Who cares what random people think?" She laughed nervously and said, "You do. Don't act like you don't." I didn't reply. At work, Patrick stopped by my desk. He was one of Ethan's colleagues, the one I always found easy to talk to. He said, "I saw the video. Poor guy looked like he wanted to sink through the floor." I said, "Oh, please, it wasn't that deep." He smiled, that half-teasing, half-serious smile he always had, and said, "If someone said that about me, I'd leave too." I told him Ethan knew how to handle a joke. Patrick raised an eyebrow and said, "Are you sure?" For some reason, that stuck with me. I replayed it in my mind later, sitting in the parking lot, watching rain streak across the windshield. I kept thinking about how calm Ethan had looked that night. Calm in a way that wasn't peace. It was distance. When I got home, he was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. The screen showed a spreadsheet, color-coded rows and columns. I leaned over and asked what it was. He said, "Budget review." I said, "Since when do you care about budgeting?" He said, "Since numbers tell the truth people avoid." I rolled my eyes and told him he was being dramatic. He didn't respond. He just clicked through the cells, his face blank, his fingers steady. The sound of the keyboard felt louder than it should have. Dinner that night was quiet. Sophie asked if Daddy was mad at me. I froze. Ethan looked up from his plate and said, "No one's mad. We're just talking less." She nodded like she accepted that answer. I smiled tightly and changed the subject. After she went to bed, I told him he shouldn't involve her in our issues. He said, "You involve the world. I can handle one question from my daughter." I didn't have a reply for that. I just went upstairs and slammed the door harder than I needed to. The next day, I tried to reset everything. I sent him a long message while he was at work. I said I was sorry, that I didn't mean for the joke to go that far, that I wanted to move forward. He didn't reply. When I called that evening, he said, "I got your message." I waited for more. He didn't add anything. By Friday, the silence between us had taken on a shape. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was structure. He spoke to Sophie normally, helped her with homework, asked about her day, but with me it was short answers and polite distance. That weekend, my mother-in-law came by unexpectedly. I tried to sound cheerful, but she looked serious. She asked if we could talk privately. Ethan was in the yard with Sophie, so I agreed. She said, "I saw that video, Liora." I sighed and said, "Of course you did. Everyone did." She said, "You embarrassed him." I told her she didn't understand modern humor. She said, "Respect isn't old-fashioned." Her voice didn't rise, but it cut. I said she was overreacting, that Ethan was fine. She said, "He's not fine. He's preparing." I laughed and said, "Preparing for what? To sulk forever?" She didn't answer, just looked at me like she wanted to say something and changed her mind. After she left, I found Ethan at his desk again. A new folder sat beside the laptop labeled Archive A. I asked what it was. He said, "Old files." I said, "Why label them like that?" He said, "So they're easier to find later." That night, I dreamed of him sitting at that desk while I tried to open drawers that kept locking. Every sound in the dream was the hum of a printer. When I woke up, there was an actual faint mechanical sound coming from downstairs. He was printing again. I walked quietly to the landing and peeked down. He was standing by the printer, collecting papers, placing them neatly into a manila envelope. I called out, "What are you doing?" He looked up and said, "Sorting receipts." I said, "At midnight?" He said, "That's when it's quiet." I didn't know what to say, so I went back upstairs. The next morning, the envelope was gone. That Sunday, I tried to break the silence with breakfast. Pancakes, his favorite. When he came into the kitchen, I smiled and said, "See, I can be nice." He said, "You've always been nice. That's not the problem." I said, "Then what is?" He said, "The joke wasn't the start, it was the summary." I didn't even understand what that meant. After he left for errands, I noticed his phone charging on the counter. A notification flashed, calendar reminder, downtown 11:45. No title, just that. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself it was a work meeting. Still, when I heard his car pull out of the driveway, something felt final about the sound. That afternoon, I called Amira again. I told her he was being cold and robotic. She said, "Maybe give him space." I said, "He's had space all week." She said, "Then give him time." I said, "Time for what? To rewrite history." After the call, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, scrolling through messages from Patrick. He'd sent a few harmless jokes, the kind that fill silence when you need attention. I told him Ethan had been distant. He said, "He's probably just embarrassed. He'll come around." I wrote, "He better." That night, when Ethan came home, he said he'd eaten already. I asked where. He said, "Downtown." I almost asked if that's what the reminder was about, but stopped myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Instead, I asked if he'd seen the new post someone made about the video being old news. He said, "It's not old for me." Then he went upstairs. I stayed on the couch for hours, replaying the party in my head. The laughter, the look on his face, the way he left without a word. I told myself he'd chosen silence because he didn't know how to handle strong women, that I scared him by being bold. That's what Amira always said. Men can't handle women who speak freely. But the truth didn't feel that simple anymore. It was in the way he looked at me without anger, in the way every object in the house seemed to shift into order, labeled folders, clean mugs, a faint smell of printer ink. It wasn't chaos or rage, it was method. And maybe that scared me more than if he'd yelled, because silence can mean patience, and patience can mean planning. By the third week, I'd started pretending his distance didn't bother me. I told myself if he wanted to sulk, fine. I wasn't going to chase him. I had a job, friends, and a social life that didn't revolve around his moods. At least, that's what I told everyone. In reality, the silence was starting to crawl under my skin. He spoke to me when he had to, about bills, about picking up Sophie from school, but nothing else. His tone was always polite, never warm. The politeness made it worse. It meant there was no emotion left to fight with. I started testing little ways to get a reaction, new dress, new perfume, staying out late with Amira. Nothing worked. He didn't ask questions anymore. The first time Patrick messaged me outside of work hours, it felt innocent. He'd seen a funny meme about marriage and sent it to me with a laughing emoji. I replied something like, "Too real." It became a habit after that. Little messages throughout the day, about co-workers, about lunch, about nothing. When I mentioned Ethan's name once, Patrick said, "You sure he still deserves you?" I laughed it off, but it stuck in my head. We started having coffee after work. At first, it was in public places, easy to justify. Then one evening, when it was raining and he offered to drive me home, I said yes. He didn't drop me at home, though. We stopped at a small restaurant halfway across town. He said he didn't feel like going home yet. I didn't either. The restaurant was dim and quiet. I told him Ethan and I were on a break, even though that wasn't true. Patrick smiled and said, "That explains a lot." When I got home that night, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table again, reading. I told him I'd stayed late finishing a project. He nodded without looking up and said, "Hope it went well." No sarcasm, no suspicion, just calm. That calmness felt like an insult. Later, as I put my bag down, I noticed his laptop screen before it went dark. It was another spreadsheet, dates, descriptions, small notes beside each line. I caught my name written in one cell. My stomach tightened. I said, "What's that?" He said, "Tracking expenses." I said, "Since when do you track my name under expenses?" He closed the laptop gently and said, "Since I realized you're part of most of them." The way he said it made me freeze. Not angry, just factual. I laughed it off and went upstairs, but my heart was pounding. The next day, Patrick texted again. He said, "Rough night." I told him Ethan was acting weird. Patrick said, "Weird how?" I said, "Quiet. Too quiet." He replied, "That's when they're dangerous." I said, "He's not dangerous. He's boring." Patrick wrote back, "Boring men are the ones who plan before they act." I didn't know how to take that, so I ignored it. That weekend, Sophie had a school project due. Ethan helped her with it while I went shopping with Amira. When I came back, they were sitting on the living room floor surrounded by glue sticks and markers. Sophie looked up and said, "Mummy, Daddy says people can fix anything if they take time." Ethan smiled at her, but didn't look at me. That smile didn't reach his eyes. Later that night, after Sophie went to bed, I said, "You're teaching her weird things." He said, "Patience isn't weird." I said, "You make it sound like a weapon." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Only if you ignore it too long." I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m, I went downstairs for water. His office door was cracked open. Inside, the glow from his screen lit his face. He was typing something, slow and careful. There was a faint beep from his phone every few minutes. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Finishing something." I asked, "What something?" He said, "Follow up." I went back upstairs without saying anything. The next day, I decided to distract myself. Patrick texted saying a few co-workers were getting drinks after work. I said I'd come. When I showed up, it was just him. He said the others bailed. I stayed anyway. We drank, laughed, and I let myself lean closer than I should have. He touched my hand once, and I didn't pull away. I told myself it didn't count as anything. Just attention, just what Ethan refused to give me. When I came home, the house was dark again. A faint smell of printer toner hung in the air. On the counter sat 2 mugs, both clean but placed far apart. My heart sank a little. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I told myself I didn't owe him explanations, but guilt crawled in anyway. The next morning, he left a note on the table. "School pickup today, meeting downtown." That word again. Downtown, always written neatly, with a time. I wondered what kind of meeting needed to happen every week in the same place. At work, Patrick teased me about how quiet I looked. I said, "Just tired." He asked if Ethan was still acting distant. I said, "Yeah, but I'm over it." He smiled and said, "Good. Don't let him make you small." I told him I wasn't small. He said, "You'd be surprised what silence can shrink." That night, I tried to make dinner special. I cooked his favorite dish, played soft music, poured wine. He came home, looked at the table and said, "Looks nice." I said, "You could sound more enthusiastic." He said, "I'm learning to say less." I told him, "That's your problem, you say nothing until it's too late." He said, "Not this time." We ate mostly in silence. Halfway through, Sophie asked if Daddy was moving to the guest room for good. Ethan said, "Just for now." I laughed, said she was being dramatic, but her face looked confused, like she didn't know which of us to believe. After dinner, he went outside to the patio and made a phone call. I couldn't hear much, just a few quiet sentences. When he came back, I asked who it was. He said, "A friend." I said, "Since when do you have phone friends?" He smiled faintly and said, "Everyone needs witnesses." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about that word. Witnesses. It kept echoing. Over the next few days, small things started changing. A new key appeared on his keyring. A small USB drive taped under a folder labeled taxes. His phone had new contacts, one saved only as an emoji. When I asked who it was, he said, "Someone helping me stay organized." Amira said I was overthinking. "You're paranoid because you feel guilty," she told me. I said, "Guilty about what?" She said, "You tell me." The next Friday, Patrick suggested a rooftop bar after work. I said yes without even checking the time. The sunset was bright and loud, the city below glowing like it was cheering for me. I let him hold my hand just for a moment. I told myself it was harmless. When I came home, Ethan was watching TV. I sat beside him and said, "We should go out sometime, like normal couples." He said, "Normal couples don't humiliate each other in public." I said, "It's been weeks. Are you ever going to let that go?" He said, "I already did." I said, "Then why are you acting like this?" He said, "Because letting go isn't the same as forgetting." I wanted to shout, to make him show emotion, but he stayed perfectly still. Then he said something that froze me. I used to think silence meant peace. Now I know it's evidence. I didn't even understand what he meant until later. The next morning, I saw him leaving the house early with a briefcase he hadn't used in years. Sophie asked where he was going. He said, "Downtown." Then he kissed her forehead and left. By afternoon, Amira sent me a link. It was another post about the party clip, but this time the comments were cruel. People calling me disrespectful, selfish, a bully. Someone had uploaded a longer version showing Ethan's face as he walked out. I felt sick. I called Ethan to tell him, but he didn't answer. That evening, I saw him outside, sitting in his car, writing something on a notepad. When he came inside, he placed his phone face down on the counter and said, "I made dinner reservations for Sunday. Family dinner." I asked where. He said, "You'll see." I wanted to feel relieved. Finally, he was doing something normal. But there was something in his tone that didn't sound like reconciliation. It sounded like closure, waiting for the right setting. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe this was the start of things going back to normal. But as I walked upstairs later, I caught the faint smell of toner again and the quiet hum of the printer coming from behind the closed office door. Sunday arrived with sunlight that felt too bright. I spent the morning pretending everything was fine. Hair done, makeup perfect, a soft pink dress that made me look composed. Ethan was already dressed when I came downstairs, wearing the navy shirt I'd given him 2 birthdays ago. He said only, "Ready?" and helped Sophie with her shoes. His calm tone unnerved me. I told myself it meant progress. He wouldn't invite us to dinner if he wanted to end things. The restaurant he chose wasn't one we usually went to. It was quieter, more formal, the kind of place people choose for meetings. When we arrived, a table was already set near the window. Marla was there. I hadn't known she'd be joining. She smiled at Sophie, but didn't meet my eyes. My throat tightened. Ethan ordered for all of us. I made small talk, complimenting the view, asking Sophie about her art project. The conversation stayed surface level. When the waiter left, Marla said softly, "You look well, Liora." I smiled, pretending to miss the coldness behind the words. I said I'd been busy with work. She nodded, then turned to Ethan. "And you? How's everything at home?" He said, "Steady." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Halfway through the meal, I tried to laugh about something trivial. How people still mentioned that old party video. Ethan didn't look up. Marla said, "Some things stay online longer than we think." I said, "People have short memories. It'll blow over." Ethan said, "Not everything needs to." Sophie fidgeted in her seat, looking between us. I reached for her hand, trying to redirect the mood. "You finished your project, sweetheart?" She nodded. "Daddy said we should always tell the truth even if it's hard." I froze. Ethan didn't react. Marla glanced at me, then down at her plate. When the check came, Ethan stood and said he'd take care of it. I noticed him sign something neatly, his handwriting precise. He placed the pen back in his pocket like it mattered. As we walked to the parking lot, he said he'd drive separately because he needed to stop somewhere first. I asked where. He said, "Downtown." That night, after Sophie went to bed, I tried to talk to him. "Why did you bring your mother?" I asked. He said, "It was time she saw things clearly." I said, "Saw what?" He said, "Patterns." I told him I didn't understand what that meant. He said, "You never do until it's too late." Then he went to the guest room and closed the door. The next morning, Marla called. Her voice was polite but sharp. "Liora," she said, "Ethan will handle things properly now. He doesn't want arguments." I said, "Handle what? We're fine." She said, "He's done trying to explain." I hung up before I started shaking. At work, I told Amira about it. She said, "Maybe he's bluffing, trying to scare you." I said, "He's not the type to bluff." She said, "Then what's he doing?" I didn't know. All I could picture was that careful signature on the receipt, the way his words felt rehearsed. That evening, I picked up Sophie from school. She showed me a drawing she'd made, 2 houses side by side, connected by a dotted line. I asked what it was. She said, "That's when people live near each other but not together." I told her that wasn't happening. She just looked out the window. When we got home, Ethan's car was already in the driveway. He was in the living room, sorting papers into piles. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Organizing the week." I said, "Can you stop with all this mystery and just talk to me?" He said, I am talking. I sat down across from him. You're making it seem like I've done something unforgivable. He said, You made something unforgettable. I said, You're holding on to one joke like it defines me. He said, It defines what you think love is. The calmness in his tone made me want to scream. I told him I was tired of him acting like a saint, that everyone makes mistakes. He said, Mistakes end. Choices continue. I turned away, blinking hard so he wouldn't see the tears. He went back to his papers. There was a faint printer sound again, steady and quiet. I wanted to tear the machine out of the wall. Later that night, I went through his desk drawers. Most were empty except one that clicked locked. The only thing on top was a small sticky note with the words, Bring forms. My chest tightened. I put it back exactly as it was. The next morning, he was already dressed when I came downstairs. He said he'd drop Sophie off at school and that I could rest. I asked if we were going to talk later. He said, I'll let you know. His voice was calm, final. All day my stomach hurt from the waiting. I called Amira, told her I couldn't stand not knowing what was coming. She said, Maybe he's filing something. I said, Like what? She said, Liora, people don't stay calm this long unless they have a plan. When I hung up, I noticed a message on my phone from an unknown number, just one line. Delivery scheduled tomorrow morning, no name, no details. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a package I'd forgotten about. But as I stood in the kitchen, staring at that message, the hum of the printer started again upstairs. Each sound felt like a countdown I didn't understand. That night, he didn't come home for dinner. I sat alone, watching the clock, waiting for headlights in the driveway. When he finally walked in, it was late. He looked tired but peaceful. I asked where he'd been. He said, Finalizing something. I asked what. He said, You'll find out soon. Then he kissed Sophie goodnight and went to the guest room. I wanted to believe this was just another quiet fight that would fade like the others, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. His silence no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like preparation reaching its end. The morning started like nothing had changed, but something in the air felt sharp. Ethan was gone before I woke up, his side of the bed smooth, the pillow untouched. In the kitchen, his mug sat clean beside mine, as if even the distance between them had been measured. A short note lay on the counter. Take Sophie to school. I'll be back late. The handwriting was calm, patient, and final. Sophie hummed in the car, unaware of the tension. She asked if Daddy was still mad. I said, He's just tired. She nodded, satisfied with that simple answer children believe until they learn better. At work, I tried to focus, but the day dragged. Every few hours I checked my phone, hoping for a message. None came. Around lunchtime, Amira called and asked if I'd heard anything. I said no. She said, Maybe he's just letting it sink in. I said, It's been weeks. She sighed and told me to give him space, but I didn't want space. I wanted control. By late afternoon, Patrick stopped by my desk. You look exhausted, he said. I told him I hadn't been sleeping well. He asked if things were still bad with Ethan. I said, He barely talks to me. Patrick smiled a little. You don't need someone who punishes you with silence. His tone was soft, careful. For a second, I almost believed him. We met for a drink after work. I told myself it was harmless, just a distraction. The bar was half empty, and the low music made it easy to pretend I was someone else, someone admired, not avoided. Patrick made me laugh, said Ethan didn't know how lucky he'd been. I smiled too long at that. When I got home later, the lights were off except for the dim glow from under the guest room door. I didn't knock. The next morning, Ethan made breakfast for Sophie. She giggled as he flipped pancakes, her voice filling the kitchen like nothing had happened. I said, You're up early. He said, I wanted her to have a good start. His tone wasn't cold, it was careful, practiced. After Sophie left for school, He stayed at the table, scrolling on his phone. I asked, "Are you ever going to tell me what's going on?" He said, "Everything's already being handled." That word, handled, made my chest tighten. "Handled how?" I asked. He looked up for the first time. "Properly," he said. Then he gathered his papers, slipped on his jacket, and left. The day dragged again. I tried to call him twice. Both went to voicemail. Around 3, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Reminder: appointment confirmed tomorrow, 9:30 a.m. No name, no details. I thought it might be a mistake, but the unease stayed. That evening, when he came home, I was waiting in the living room. "Ethan," I said, "this has gone far enough. We need to talk." He set his bag down calmly and said, "About what?" I said, "About us." He said, "We did. You called me sensitive. Then you called it a joke. I listened." I took a step closer. "So what now? You're just done?" He looked at me for a long time. "Not done," he said. "Just finished pretending this is normal." He walked past me toward the hallway. I followed him. "You can't fix a marriage by avoiding it," he said. "I'm not fixing it. I'm documenting it." Those words hit harder than shouting ever could. That night, I lay awake listening to faint sounds from his office, the click of drawers, the hum of the printer, the careful rhythm of someone who had all the time in the world. I thought about opening the door, about demanding to see what he was doing, but something in me stopped. I didn't want to see. When I finally drifted to sleep, I dreamed of paperwork falling like snow, each sheet stamped with his quiet resolve. The next morning, he dressed in silence, tie straight, shoes polished. Sophie asked if he'd be home for dinner. He said, "I'll try." Then he kissed her forehead and left. The house stayed still after that, filled only with the smell of paper and printer ink. I sat at the table, staring at the empty doorway, trying to convince myself he was bluffing. But Ethan wasn't a man who bluffed. He was a man who prepared, and by now everything in his life looked prepared, down to the smallest detail. When I went upstairs later, the hallway was quiet, except for the faint echo of his last words repeating in my mind. Steady, certain, unshakable. "I'll handle it properly." He met me in the courthouse lobby the next morning, standing beside a clerk who held a stack of papers. He didn't look angry, just resolved. When she called my name, I realized what it was. Petition for separation, temporary custody, financial orders. People turned to watch as he signed. I opened my mouth to speak, but he'd already walked away, leaving silence and signatures behind.